Hello 5612 instructor. In this presentation, I will discuss the methods and criteria I use to collect data from our world language teaching unit. I will discuss my findings as well as the interpretations and conclusions I have drawn from this data. Let's begin. Starting with methods for data collection. I collected data about the summative IPA task of my unit, which in this case was a presentational writing task. I collected data for one class of Spanish 2 students, but feel that this sample would be representative of all student learning. Here was the task. Students had to create an original ofrenda, as well as write an accompanying description paragraph describing the ofrenda and giving some information about the Day of the Dead and the person their ofrenda honored. I scored this task using the IPA rubric for novice performance, specifically in the presentational mode. Other methods included in data collection were can-do statements, but it should be said that no student reported data was available, either pre or post-assessment. Thus, I attempted to fill out the can-do statements for each learner, but opted not to include them in their final score, for reasons that I will discuss in the conclusion. However, so you can see, here are the can-do statements, as well as the IPA presentational rubric for novice learners. Turning now to criteria that demonstrated learning. In order to meet the growth target for this SLO, students were expected to grow one full level. Because we did not have a formal pre-assessment, all students were placed at Novice Low 2 in regards to how they could perform this specific task with the minimal prior knowledge they had. Thus, over the course of the SLO, they were expected to grow to perform at the Novice Mid 2 level to demonstrate growth. They were scored using the IPA rubric and conversion formula, and their score was categorized in one of the following categories. I cross-checked this with the ODE Novice Mid Holistic rubric for performance, and used this to distinguish within the levels of Novice Mid performance. Thus, if students performed at the growth target, which was Novice Mid 2, they demonstrated full evidence of this level of performance. Anything less would be Novice Mid 1, and anything more could be Novice Mid 3 or potentially above. So let's examine the data. Here is the table documenting student progress from pre-assessment through post-assessment. As we can see, 15 out of 18 students met or exceeded the growth target. This means that 83% of students performed at the Novice Mid 2 level or higher. With respect to the SLO data, this means that the SLO would receive a rating of 4 or above average student performance. Honing a little more specifically on the pre and post numbers, again, all students were rated at Novice Low 2 in lieu of a formal pre-assessment, and in the post-assessment, only 3 students scored Novice Mid 1 level proficiency, 8 students scored Novice Mid 2 level proficiency, and 7 scored the Novice Mid 3, which again, 18 out of 15 exceeded or met the growth target. Now I will discuss the IPA rubric criteria and some of the interpretations and conclusions I can draw from this data. As you can see, I've reordered the IPA criteria in terms of most to least student growth, where I observed this across my unit. I made these decisions based on how many students scored in each of the categories and then reordered them accordingly. As we can see, text type was where students demonstrated the most growth, with 8 exceeding, 9 meeting strongly, and 2 meeting minimally. Students wrote strong, complete sentences in their final IPA presentational writing task. And I attribute this to an alignment between the formative and summative assessments. I also attribute this to the functional chunks that I introduced in instruction and that were practiced repeatedly. This, and combined with scaffolding and modeling of appropriate sentences that I would be expecting for students, helped contribute to their success. Additionally, students showed really strong language control throughout their work. I was particularly impressed with the ofrenda-related items, as that was the vocabulary of the unit that we worked on. With the exception of 2 outliers who simply did not perform this aspect of the task, 16 out of 18 students were able to list ofrenda items. I attribute this to the fact that this vocabulary was learned through binding and comprehensible input. Additionally, students practiced this in their IGA activity, and the negotiation of meaning, I believe, helped facilitate this learning. Finally, students displayed some growth with respect to comprehensibility of their work. They particularly were great about naming the person their ofrenda honored. As aforementioned, this aspect of vocabulary was previously learned, but I did take a special effort to refresh this model and then practice in pairs. By activating this prior knowledge and then giving some students the opportunity to work with it and produce it, I believe that this had contributed to their success in their final task. So I will now discuss how I used assessment to make decisions about my teaching. Starting at the very beginning and in line with backward design, I knew what the end was going to be, I knew what my goal was, and I planned instruction accordingly. So in order for students to be able to create and describe ofrendas, I needed to give them the vocabulary they would need and align my instruction with this goal. Additionally, I knew that my summative assessment would be a presentational writing task, and thus assess this mode more frequently and intentionally with this in mind. This was especially important with the reduced instruction of this year's particular WLTU. Finally, I was very intentional about scaffolding the tasks that I had learners do. This was informed largely by my standards deconstruction work, as well as the learning targets for each unit. The combination of this, I believe, helps learners to be very successful in their final task. Additionally, I used assessment to modify instruction in the moment. Although students were not able to fill out pre- and post-can-do statements, I did perform an informal prior knowledge assessment during the first Jamboard activity. As I began the instructional conversation, I observed that students lacked the target language vocabulary that they needed to respond to my questions. Thus, I shifted my questioning strategies and provided the scaffold through forced choice questioning, giving them vocabulary options until they were able to produce more independently. Another example of how I modified instruction based on assessment could be seen in the first exit ticket. I noticed that students were confusing the ofrenda and Kobe Bryant Memorial elements. To the students who made this error, I provided feedback and then addressed it the next day in the warm-up activity. Also, as the day went on, I realized that the directions themselves were causing students confusion and modified them and saw stronger results in later periods. Finally, our third day warm-up included a Padlet activity. Unfortunately, students struggled writing coherent sentences when we began this. Several students did. To remediate this error, I highlighted strong examples, gave explicit feedback, and modeled what I was expecting from students. I noticed some students editing their responses in the moment, but really saw a lot stronger responses in their summative assessment, which I attribute to this modification. The categories that showed the least growth were listed on the prior table, but I've honed in on them specifically. They were language function and impact. Upon reflection, I believe that there were some changes that I could make to see better results with respect to this data. First, I would provide more explicit instruction involving description and descriptive vocabulary. Potentially an idea I had was an information gap activity that described ofrenda elements themselves instead of listing them. This could potentially help performance on the summative task. Also, I think more creative formative tasks would have helped them with their summative assessment, but again, due to reduced instruction, we'll just incorporate this for next time. So in conclusion, what did I learn from my data and analysis? Overall, students demonstrated above average growth. Again, for only 3 days of instruction, I was really impressed, but it should be noted that this was only their presentational skills, and this isn't even representative of the full range of their growth. However, there were some factors I felt should be mentioned before closing. First, with respect to the can-do statements. In their absence, I realized the essential role they play in informing instruction and growth targets, and will 100% be including them next time. Upon reflection, I was able to identify some discrepancies between the novice mid can-do statements and what my task required of learners. This, combined with the fact that they did not self-assess, but rather I assessed them, made me feel like this was not an accurate representation of student growth, and I decided not to include them. Going forward, I will do a much better job aligning the task in the can-do statements, as well as having learners fill them out themselves. Finally, it should be noted there were a few outlier students in my sample. 2 students in particular displayed novice mid proficiency with respect to language function, text type, etc. However, they did not demonstrate any cultural or concept knowledge that was addressed in the unit. In order to remediate this discrepancy, I believe a solution could be including genre-specific features on the IPA rubric so that it's not addressing content or proficiency, but rather both in an integrated way. And lastly, because of the digital format, some students utilize more online resources than were allowed, but believe that using a paper-based IPA could remediate this error. Thank you.